Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Our guest today is Michael Banissy. He's a touch scientist who will show us how touch can enhance our well-being. Michael, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now, you've written a book, Touch Matters. I think this is very interesting, and I want you to know we've been on almost 35 years. You are the first person with the title Touch Scientist. You're also a neuroscientist, am I correct? Is that where that heading comes under?
Yeah. So my background is I'm a social neuroscientist. So I study the brain basis of social interaction. And one of the most important cues to our social interactions is touch. So hence the book, Touch Matters.
So I just want our audience to know, while it sounds like a fun title, this is a real branch of science. This is something that you study as a professional and someone who is a neuroscientist. So you're into this field.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's many of us around the world who've been studying for decades now the importance of touch to our health, our well-being, how it happens in the brain, and all the different impacts it can have across different walks of life, everyday things from interacting with people on the streets to business to our kind of relationships.
Can you tell us, to start off, how does this matter to our happiness, our health, and our relationships? Because we think of it as something casual, and we never thought of it as a scientific project. Well,
this is the thing. I think touch is one of those senses that we engage in touching behaviors throughout the day, sometimes without thinking about the impact they can have. But it's one of our most underappreciated senses, really, because from birth, it's essential to our development and our well-being. Studies on newborn babies and their parents have shown that engaging in caregiving forms of touch, they can contribute to things like less crying, shorter hospital stays. They can lower levels of anxiety and depression in the parents sometimes as well. But right the way through to adulthood, there's lots of work now showing that simple, supportive, tactile behaviors, things like hugs from a partner or a friend, they've been shown to help reduce stress and anxiety, lower blood pressure, and even boost our immune system. So there's all sorts of different areas where touch can have really powerful impacts without us first thinking about it.
In the answer to the previous question, I heard you say it can help with crying babies, and I'm sure that any moms who are listening, their ears perked up and said, oh, this is the man I want to listen to. So tell us about that, because that sounds like you've got the cure for every mother's ills.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of different areas of this. So one of the interesting things is, we might always instinctively, if we've got a baby, we might be kind of instinctive in just trying to gently stroke them or caress them. And those kind of instinctive behaviors that we sometimes go to and that we do, even at that kind of slow, gentle speed, that's been shown to do things like reduce the amount of pain that babies can experience if they're undergoing medical procedures, like, pinprick tests to the heel. Sometimes people do those. So if you gently stroke a baby before they have those tests, you see a reduction in brain-related pain activity, and you see less crying and less fussing. But also something like, just gentle massage. So just a gentle, moderate pressure massage. That's been shown to also do things like, particularly in premature babies, actually, to lead to things like shorter hospital stays, to improve things like sleep of the baby as well. And some of these benefits then kind of carry through, obviously, to the parents in different spaces as well.
Now, of course, we've probably heard it along the way, a baby needs a hug, go in and rock the baby to sleep, etc. But what about once we pass that baby age and we get to be, and I'm going to even take us out of the early childhood, so, maybe 10, 15 years old, 20, does that still have a physical appearance from your studies?
Yeah, touch is really vital to our social connections throughout life. And that's right the way, we mentioned kind of 10 and teenage age groups there, but right the way through to, kind of the elderly, touch can be really important. And some of the ways it can do that can be connected predominantly to the benefits it can bring to our health and well-being. So, for instance, people that more regularly engage in hugging, it's been shown that they can have kind of better responses to stressful situations and things like this. So one study, for instance, found that people who engaged more regularly with hugs over 14 days prior to the study had differences in their kind of stress-related responses. They had better stress-related responses than those that did not. Another study found that if you looked at how often people hugged for 14 days and then you gave them a cold, you exposed them to a cold virus, these people were less likely to develop the virus symptoms than people who less regularly engaged in hugs for those 14 days before it. So these kind of simple things are coming out from the medical literature as well as the neuroscience literature, pointing to the benefits of something as simple as a hug to our everyday routine.
So this isn't just like a good feeling, like have a birthday party. I can see you've really studied this, and obviously you have, and you've gotten behind it, and there's medical proof for what you say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us might, many of us can instinctively think, well, a hug might feel good, right? Or maybe someone holding our hands might feel good. But actually, there's a lot more to it behind that, and it seems that potentially the gestures that they mean, the fact that they're showing us social support, that can be really beneficial for our health. But also, if you go back to something like someone gently stroking your arm, that kind of slow, gentle stroking that we spoke about with babies. Well, even in adults, if you do that, you've actually in your skin, you've got a particular type of receptor that's attuned. It's specialized to try to detect those slow, gentle strokes. And when you do that, these receptors send signals to our brain and release hormones that are involved in calming our nervous system, bringing us to baseline, relaxing us. And it's also a social reward. So our brain finds these types of nice, gentle, comforting touches socially rewarding. So there's lots of benefits that come from it that aren't just how it feels, but actually at a biological underpinning in terms of the brain and the biology behind it.
Now, I bet you have, and I said to you before the show, if you have any anecdotes, you can feel free to throw them in. I bet you have a lot of interesting stories that come out of this, because either a positive or negative, meaning someone may approach it the wrong way or overdo it, or when they talk to you about hugs. Do you have any you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, naturally, I mean, it's very easy when you hear a scientist come on and talk about the benefits that you might just want to go around hugging everybody all the time. And of course, we've got to be mindful. I think we're all aware that touch is complicated, right? In today's world, not everyone will enjoy the same type of touch, right? And so I think we do have to be really careful of that. And I suppose one of the general kind of, well, not so much an anecdote, but a general caveat to everything I'm saying is, sometimes we might need to find different ways to support one another. But one of the great things about touch is that it's not just hugs that help, right? Gently stroking someone's arm can help. Holding someone's hand can help. There's all sorts of different ways. And there are non-tactile ways as well. So we want to adapt to suit different people. But I mean, anecdotally, one of the things that I suppose for myself, and I talk about this a bit in the book, because as I found the importance of hugs was actually something I came across called the Free Hug campaign. And I don't know if this is something that is present in the US at all, but I came across it in Australia when I visited, actually, and it was shortly after a long-term relationship had ended, and I was there, slightly jet-lagged, strolling around, and probably in that moment for the first time in a long while, kind of really questioning, what's going on in my life? Where am I going? And suddenly there was this person there just standing there holding a sign that said free hugs. And I kind of took the hug from this random gentleman in Australia, and it suddenly changed my mindset and sent me on a very positive way. And free hugs is a massive movement that's taken off all around the world with similar stories like that. Just this idea of the kindness of strangers helping one another in that way.
I'm just thinking that would have been the perfect cover for your book.
Yeah.
You probably weren't writing it at the time, but you coming up to someone with a sign that literally, and it's real too. It's not one of those stage things, because you're telling us how perfect, free hugs, and at a time when you needed it.
Yeah, exactly. And, and as I say, naturally, it's not for everyone. I don't think everyone will want to hug a stranger on the street. And, we do have to find other ways to support one another sometimes. But there is this much, more and continually more evidence coming out, not just in the US, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, showing that hugs can provide benefits if we view them as supportive, right? And I think that's the key. We've got to view them as supportive. We've got to be happy with them happening to us.
Yeah, Michael, when we first started talking before the show this evening, I thought, wow, this would be a perfect reality show or even a sitcom for TV. Because first of all, I don't think, just much like myself, no one has ever heard of a touch specialist and a touch doctor, someone who specializes in touching. And I could see you like the Fraser Crane on TV, or we have a channel here that specializes Dr. Pimple Popper, people who are very overweight, have different problems with their feet, and the hug doctor would fit perfectly in there. So do you ever get approached for something like that? Or has someone come up to you and said, let's do this?
Yeah, well, I think I might have to get you to try and pitch me to some studios by the sounds of it.
We'll talk after the show and explore a few ideas.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I mean, one of the studies that we have done over the years is we've done studies looking at what I suppose what's the ideal duration of a hug? What's the ideal kind of feel of a hug? Because when we talk about hugging, right, there's all sorts of ways. You might have from the back hug, you might have a bear hug, you might hug someone for a short time, like 1 second. Some people might go for 10 seconds or more, right? And so we have had requests at times to kind of go on and discuss what the perfect hug is. And I kind of have to do a spoiler alert that there is probably no perfect hug. There's some things that we probably don't want to do. We don't want to do too brief hugs. So a hug of 1 second, you tend to not find that many benefits from. It tends to need to be 5 seconds or more. But how much is or more? That we're not sure on just yet, but I can imagine all of us might feel uncomfortable if someone's just holding on for too long and not letting go, right? So,
exactly, and there's an episode for our show, so yeah, we have to work on that. Before we go further, Michael, I'd like our audience to know that if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Our guest today is Michael Banissy. He is the author of Touch Matters. And Michael, could you tell us the website where we can find out more about touch?
Yeah, sure. So it's just www.banissy.com, which is my surname. And you can find out more there about all of our research and access to all the books and information there as well.
And I always tell our audience, even if you're just listening to this show casually, what an interesting topic to talk about next time you're on a train or a bus or an airplane, and that you heard a show about touch and how that important that is. And I'm sure the person has never heard of this because I never had an expert on concerning touch before. And as I said, we've done about 1,800 shows. So you're our first touch expert. So you can be head of that department for The Secrets of Success. When you're dealing with people, do they kind of look at you like, are you serious about this?
Yeah, I feel that does happen. I think people they're understandably sometimes skeptical. And I think touch itself, we've also become quite skeptical of it as a sense, right? I think over the years, there's a number of reasons, naturally. I think where we've heard people misusing, I suppose, their license to touch. And as a consequence, we're a lot more cautious about it. And I think, but there's also a sense of, I suppose, an understanding in it as well once you start talking to people. Because, for instance, back in 2020, we asked nearly 40,000 people worldwide, what does touch mean to them? And we just said, just give us 3 words. Just, pick any single word you like. The 3 words that people picked, and we saw this consistently across, over 112 different world regions, were comforting, connection, and care. So even though touch is full of this nuance and these things that, we understand we might be skeptical of, at its heart, a lot of us go back to think about touch in this comforting, caring way. So there is also a sense, I guess, when we talk to people about this, that they're like, yeah, well, I kind of get why having regular hugs might be good for me because it shows me somebody cares, right? It conveys that support. So there's a kind of balance of skepticism, but also, I suppose, an understanding that goes along with it.
Michael, a lot of us like to complain, and one of the complaints we often hear is, oh, darn it, everything happens to me. Well, you've written a book about touch, and it's a recent book. So that means you were working on it during the pandemic, I imagine, or at least some part of the pandemic. And on top of all that, you're working on it in an era where at least once a month, if we pick up the newspapers, someone is complaining that their boss, their coworker, touched them inappropriately or did something involving touch inappropriately. Do you almost say to yourself, oh, why me? I came out with this. I'm a specialist in touch in an era when everybody is so sensitive about it that if you brush past them, they might feel you're being inappropriate or too close because of the pandemic or other reasons. Has that been a problem?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that study we did in early 2020, and some people called that the most ill-timed scientific study to ever run, because obviously we didn't know the pandemic was coming, but we started it about a week or so before, and we had all this data coming in. So certainly society can interact with the science at times. In a way, I think it makes it more interesting, actually. For me, both, I suppose, as a scientist, but also personally, the pandemic was really telling about the importance of touch in life. And part of the reason actually I wrote the book was because even though I kind of thought I knew all of this stuff, I thought I know touch is important. It wasn't until it was kind of taken away from me in the lockdowns that we had in the UK that I realized just how much I was missing it and the impact it was having, on my own mental health and, the relationships that I was seeking with, family that I couldn't see and so forth. So I suppose it's a pro and a con living in a society where touch is such a hot topic right now.
Now, I'm also going to put you on the hot griddle when I ask you the next question, because we're also in a world where people seem to isolate themselves. A young couple who are obviously dating go into a restaurant. They sit down at the table. There's a nice candle. It's romantic. And they take out their cell phones and they don't talk. And we've all seen that, and we've heard from people, and, different variations of it. But 90% obviously true in different situations. You'll see people who are on a date or meant to be romantic and just kind of ignore each other. Is that making your work with touch even more important to show what's happening? Because to me, the world seems to be polarized. It's tense. We keep seeing bad news. People are shooting people for no reason.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that point about, I suppose, couples and relationships, touch there's a series of work over several years now, from the 1970s right the way through until the modern day, showing that, touch is such an important part of relationships. It acts a bit like a social glue, really. It kind of brings us closer together. It bonds us. And there are studies now showing that, that couples that engage, more often in touch can, be more kind of satisfied with their relationships if it aligns with both of their desires, of course. But even something as simple as a simple kind of touch on the arm during a conversation. There was a study that came out a year or so ago now, which basically had just couples came into the lab and they sat on the couch and they were just having a chat. And during that conversation, they either touched each other or they didn't. And then later on, they were just asked, how positive do you feel about the conversation? How positive do you feel about your relationship? And this was just a really boring conversation, an everyday conversation they had. Those that touched had a much more positive view of their relationship, just from a very brief tactile interaction. That was kind of one finding in it. But the really interesting thing was that benefit, that kind of positive interaction gain and that positive view they had, that carried forward for over a week later. They still felt more positive just from 10 minutes where they're actually talking to each other, not just talking, but they also touched. So there's just something additive in touch that just brings us that bit closer to one another.
And I had heard something about that many, many years ago about couples, kind of the less they touch, the less the relationship, less force it had, or whatever the term might be, or intimacy, etc. You have an expression called touch hunger. What is that?
Yeah, so this refers to people who are effectively craving more touch in their lives. So the amount of touch they have in their life does not align with their desires. Sorry, does not align with the amount that they're receiving. So they desire more than they're actually receiving. And sadly, when you ask people, are you getting enough touch in your life right now? More often than not, most people actually say they're not. So our study in the early part of 2020 asked this, and we found 54% of people felt they weren't getting enough touch in their lives. And for comparison, only 4% of people felt they were getting too much touch in their life. There was work that came after this. So this was during the pandemic. One study said it was more like 80% of people felt they weren't getting enough touch in their lives. And of course, you might say, well, pandemic restrictions. But even before our studies, so back in 2015, there was a researcher called Corey Floyd, who's based at the University of Arizona. And in Corey's study, he simply asked people, are you getting enough affection in your life? Do you think Americans are getting enough affection in your lives? And he found that nearly 75% of people felt they weren't. So
we're not. You're saying
we're not.
We're not getting it. Wow.
They felt they weren't. So there's this real thing where a lot of people feel they're lacking touch in their lives or they're lacking affection in their lives. And for me, that's quite startling because other research has shown that when people feel more touch hungry, they're more likely to be lonely. They're more likely to have increased anxiety. They're more likely to have greater kind of feelings of depression. So it's quite scary, really, if we're not getting this. And this, for me as well, then how can we start to think about ways to support people to be able to bring more in? And I can appreciate that's not always as simple as saying, we'll just find somebody to hug, because maybe we can't do that. maybe we need to look at other ways. And what kind of substitutes might we look for? Could we, for instance, I don't know, look at stroking pets? Could stroking a pet bring because that can calm us, that can release hormones that calm us and bring us to a state of relaxation. But maybe something else, maybe just something as simple as, engaging in something like gardening, right? Which might sound a strange thing to do, but actually gardening is the kind of thing where you're going to be touching the earth and touching yourself in very kind of casual ways, like just putting your hands on your legs or something like that. That can ground you, that can calm you. But it also provides the opportunity to potentially connect with others. If you, for instance, engage in something like community gardening, you're going to engage in touch with things where you can feel them and you can engage, but you're also going to have a chance to meet other people and interact socially, which could be really beneficial as well.
This is more and more fascinating as you go on. And I don't know if you can see the notes I have on my page, but you're already filling them up. I'm writing the things. And I love that expression, social glue. I think that's the title of your next article, or if you write another book, I think that would, because I would have to read, what is he talking about, social glue? It would seriously, it would draw me in. And that's the way when I go to a bookstore, if the book draws me in with the title, it already has me about 90%. And if the first two paragraphs are good, I'm buying it. So I'm going with that. Michael, before we go further, I want our audience to know that you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Our guest today is Michael Banissy. He is the author of the book, Touch Matters. And Michael, again, we're going to ask you if you'd give us that website.
Yeah, sure. It's just banissy.com.
Easy enough to remember. We'll ask you once more time at the end of the show. And to our audience, if you missed part of the show, and if you're as interested as I am, you can go to nccradio.org and simply look for the podcast of our show. It's Secrets of Success, and of course, it's Touch Matters. So you can go back and hear the whole show and impress your friends with all that you know about touch. Michael, you had talked about if we really need touch. It might seem funny, but little kids walk around, and even my dog has a stuffed toy that she likes to play with occasionally, and she's had it since she was a puppy. We all had a favorite toy growing up, that soft teddy bear, doll, something. It might seem immature for adults, but do we kind of need that maybe when we go to bed to have a good luck teddy bear or frog or something?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can see what you mean in terms of it might sound a bit silly, I suppose, for adults. But actually, there are now people building what they call almost social companion robots, which are designed particularly for adults, right? And particularly those that maybe can't have pets or anything like that in their lives. And so a lot of this work that's been done on that has actually been done in care homes. So work, for instance, in care homes with elderly residents has found that getting residents in care homes to interact with these social robots. It's actually one of the main ones is it's a seal, believe it or not, like a social seal. So it's got the fur, like a little robotic seal, and getting the residents to stroke the seal and engage with the seal can provide lots of benefits to their health and their well-being. It can, reduce their experiences of pain, just much like real touch can. So that's one way. But even in younger adults, there's similar findings. Some people they don't have like furry robotic seals they use. Some people just have like plastic robotic dogs, and engaging with those can also lead to some benefits as well. So people are looking at this in different ways. This kind of field of, I suppose we might call it haptic wellness. And what we mean, haptics is a kind of more kind of technical term that's sometimes used to discuss touch. But this idea of touch technology, haptic wellness, it's an area that I think we're going to see more and more creeping into society as we go forward.
Now, whenever anything new comes out, we think of touch being children first off. And of course, our grandson comes up to us or a child, we give them a hug, or most times that's the case, or romantic. So, but now once we get past age 35 or 45 or 50, what about those of us in our golden years? And I see you have that in your book. How does that help seniors, or does it? Is it time to stop touching?
Absolutely. These benefits that we're talking about, they're seen potentially right the way throughout life. And one of the interesting things about touch is that we have these two systems, right? We have discriminative touch. So that's the kind of thing that lets us do those kind of fine-grained tactile detections, if you want to feel the difference between certain textures or something like this. And then you've got affective touch. And affective touch is all the touch that's about social support. It's about those kind of gentle strokes. It's about the cuddling. It's all about those types of things that have that, I suppose, emotional component to it. Now, tactile discrimination that declines as we age, but our effective touch, that remains right the way through. Studies of people right up into their 90s are showing that effective touch is really present and just as strong, and I think that's makes sense, right? When we talk about the fact that these types of touch are important, touch it's a sense that's with us from our first moments right until the last, right? Is that sense that this carries right the way through. And so when we talk about the elderly, if we talk about, not just the elderly, but even people, whether it's 60, 70, 50, whatever age you want to look at, you can find benefits for touch across all different age groups. And some of these things that I've spoken about already, about how can we find touch substitutes, if you're someone who's maybe lonely and doesn't have that person to hug in your life, that can happen at any age, right? So then what are the types of substitutes that we could look at? What about, things like social companion robots? What about, thinking about certain textures we might want to engage in? What about gardening? What about these types of opportunities? Maybe we can think about some of those too.
Are some cultures or groups in society better at this than others? Yeah,
so the short answer to that is we don't know, if I'm directly honest. So naturally, there are cultural distinctions around touch. So, different individuals may kind of vary depending on where they're from and different factors like that in terms of their touching behaviors. But what's quite interesting in some of the work on touch and culture is there's actually sometimes more similarities than we might first think. So I mentioned to begin with about, the 3 words about what people use to describe touch, that idea of comforting, connection, care. Those words come out again and again across world regions. There's subtle changes. Sometimes people say affection, sometimes people say love, but the most common way people think about touch around the world is often in those types of terms. If you think about what people think is appropriate to touch or how not to touch, well, yeah, actually, most people will find that they'll be more willing to have more areas of the body touched if they have a greater emotional bond with people. You see that across regions of the world. Most people will say, well, it's okay for a family member to touch in this kind of spaces, but a stranger can't touch in these spaces. You see that across the world. So there's a lot of similarities. But there are obviously differences, right? As we said, one of the most famous studies is how often people might touch. So there was a study actually, it's quite old now, it goes back to the 1960s, but it was done in coffee shops. And basically it compared how often do people touch over an hour in Puerto Rico, how often do they touch over an hour in a US coffee shop, how often they do it in a UK one in London. And what they found was it was well over 100 touches in an hour in Puerto Rico, whereas in the UK, in London, it was 0 in 1 hour. And in the US, it was more like 7 or 8.
So if we want to touch or get touched, we better go to Puerto Rico and stay away from Great Britain.
I guess the key is probably a lot's changed in the world since the 1960s. And certainly, I'm in the US right now. And I think if I occasionally watch people in coffee shops touching, I know that sounds a bit creepy, but I'm always interested to do a bit of a people watching experiment. And I'm pretty sure there's more touching happening now.
I think it would be great to spend a week with you, Michael, just watching the experiments and learning from them. I think it might sound funny as a vacation, but I think that could be a prize on a quiz show. And I think we would all be amazed what we learned. You've been a terrific guest. I'd like our audience to know today we've been speaking with Michael Banissy. He is the author of Touch Matters. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Real pleasure.
To our audience, you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.